Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my December wrap-up. Today I'm going to be telling you about all the books I read in December. So I had a really good reading month in December. I think I read 17 things. Some of them were quite short, but I did end up getting a lot read in December. I think partly just because I had time off over Christmas, and I often find that I end up doing a lot of audiobook listening in December, between like wrapping and baking and decorating and tidying and all of the December Christmassy things. I end up listening to a lot of audiobooks. But anyway, I will start off as always with the classics. One thing I listened to on audiobook in December was Bleak House by Charles Dickens from 1853. This is the Mega Dickens read-along pick for December and January. If you don't know what the Mega Dickens read-along is, I'll leave links down below. But basically it is a 2-year read-along in which we're reading all of the novels of Charles Dickens in publication order, and we're more than halfway through now, and Bleak House was the read for December. I really love Bleak House a lot. It was a joy to reread this one. I've read it lots of times before. I'm very familiar with it and I love it a lot. It is the story of a law case that has been going on for a very, very long time, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and it is over a disputed will, and we're following various people who are caught up in the case in one way or another. It is a dual narrative. Half of it is in third person present tense, following a lot of different characters, and half of it is in first person past tense, following the narrative of Esther Summerson, a young woman who is employed as a companion to another young woman, Ada Clare, who has been a ward of Chancery in the case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and we follow Esther and all of the people around them, and what happens in the case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and it is just great. There are so many characters I love in Bleak House. There are so many elements of it that I love. There are so many plot threads that I love. The writing is fantastic. The drama of it is fantastic, and I just think it is wonderful and so good. So it was a real joy to reread Bleak House, as it always is, and another great read for the Mega Dickens read-along. I will have a whole video up at some point in January talking about Bleak House in a lot more detail, so more on this later. Then another Victorian book I read in December was Ralph the Heir by Anthony Trollope from 1871, which, if you have seen my favourite classics of 2023 video, I did declare my favourite classic of the year, and it was fantastic. I loved Ralph the Heir so much. It tells a story of various characters. There is a lawyer and his 2 daughters. They're about to adopt a kind of cousin of theirs who's coming from abroad, and there are also several people called Mr. Newton, like 4 people called Mr. Newton, 2 of which are called Ralph Newton, just for extra confusion. There is Ralph the Heir, who is due to inherit a property from his uncle, Mr. Newton / Squire Newton, and then there is also Ralph the illegitimate, the son of the present Squire of Newton, who, because he's illegitimate, is not due to inherit, but he is in many ways a better man than Ralph the Heir, and we follow the kind of relationships between the 2 Ralphs and other characters and the 3 young ladies who I've already mentioned, and it's just great. I just really love so many things in Anthony Trollope, but I think some of the things I love best about him are his kind of complicated inheritance plots, his flawed young men where you're not really sure if they're going to be redeemably flawed or irredeemably flawed, and his like grumpy old squires. And I just feel like Anthony Trollope combines all of those things at their best in Ralph the Heir. I also loved the characters of Ralph the illegitimate and his father, the Squire of Newton. They were 2 of my favourite Anthony Trollope characters I've encountered for ages, and I just thought Ralph the Heir was fantastic. So I highly, highly recommend it. What a great book. Then I also read one Victorian short story in December, and that was a reread for me. I read Christmas Storms and Sunshine by Elizabeth Gaskell from 1848. As I mentioned before on this channel, I'm in a book club where every month we read a poetry collection, a play and a short story, and we decided to read some Christmassy stuff for December, so Christmas Storms and Sunshine was the short story pick which I chose, and it was really fun to reread this one. I hadn't read it for a few years. Christmas Storms and Sunshine is a short festive story set on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, following the wives of 2 men who work for opposing newspapers in the print rooms, and because they work for like politically opposite newspapers, they don't like each other and their wives don't like each other, but obviously it's Christmas time, maybe they're gonna find it in their hearts to see past their differences and get on, and it's just great fun. I really, really like it. Then I also read 2 Indian classics in December. One was The Home and the World by Rabindranath Tagore. This is a novel from 1960 2016, and it was translated from Bengali into English by the author's nephew, Surendra Das Tagore. And this was a really fantastic novel. I thought this was really, really interesting, very powerful, with some really fascinating themes and some really fascinating characters. So this book is told from the alternating perspectives of three different characters. We have a husband and wife. The husband is a wealthy landowner in Bengal, and then we have a friend of the husband's who comes to stay with them. And this friend is very charismatic, very political, and he's a kind of important figure in the nationalistic Swadeshi movement, which is basically a movement to boycott British goods, which the friend is very in favour of, but the husband is not in favour of. And basically this book looks at kind of like growing political unrest in the area, and also the growingly complicated relationships between these three individuals, especially as the wife starts to kind of fall for this politically active friend who has come to stay. And it's just a very powerful and very complex, and all of the characters are very nuanced and very three-dimensional, and the kind of relationships between them and the complexities of the relationships between them are really, really interesting. And I just thought it was so fantastically drawn, and the kind of mix of like big political issues with this kind of like private domestic complexity was just fantastic. So I highly recommend The Home and the World. I thought it was a really great book. And then the other Indian classic I read this month was Train to Pakistan by Khushwant Singh from 1956, which is a book about the partition between India and Pakistan in the 1940s. And it looks very movingly and powerfully at a village on the border made up chiefly of Muslim and Sikh families who for the most part have lived together very comfortably for a long time, but now partition is creating new tensions and kind of wrenching these people apart. And it's just really powerful, really affecting, fantastically written, and the ending is amazing. So I highly recommend Train to Pakistan. It was a really fantastic read. Then I also read two Jamaican classics in December. One was The Hills Were Joyful Together by Roger Mace from 1953. It looks at various characters who kind of live around the same yard, on the same street, and all of the kind of complexities of their relationships. A lot of these people are kind of like right at the bottom of society. They don't have much money, they don't have many prospects, and a lot of their relationships are quite damaging. There's a lot in this book about violence and kind of how people are forced into desperate actions by the kind of social situations they're in. And we're following various characters, particularly what happens when kind of the closest the book has to a main character is kind of persuaded to commit a crime and ends up in prison. So this book also looks at kind of like the justice system and prisons in Jamaica in the 1950s. I feel this was a really powerful book with a lot of great characters. Roger Mace is also a playwright, and it definitely is a book that reads like it might have been written by a playwright. It's very dialogue heavy, and there's a lot of like moving between different scenes and different characters, and kind of watching all the drama unfold around this yard. I just thought it was a really good book, one I definitely recommend, though like I said, quite a grim read in places. And then the other Jamaican classic I read in December was this. This is a collection of poetry by Una Marsden, her kind of selected poems. She was writing chiefly from the kind of 1930s to the 1960s, and this was a bit of a mix for me. I would say that like the majority of poems in this book I didn't get much out of. Like, I would say the majority of the poems in this book were sort of like 2-star reads for me. And then there were like a few that were like 5-star fantastic. So it's just one of those ones that was a real hit or miss. I do think partly this is her selected poems, and it goes kind of in chronological order. And I would say that in general, her early poems I didn't get much out of. A lot of her early poems are kind of like love poems that felt a little bit nothingy to me. And then kind of later on in the collection there were some poems with sort of different, more interesting themes I thought that I enjoyed more, but in general I didn't love this collection. There were a few poems that I thought were great, but yeah, overall it wasn't really for me. Sticking on classic poetry, I also read The Aerial Poems by T.S. Eliot in December. This was the Christmas poetry pick for my book club, and this is a collection of I think 5 or 6 poems that were published in the 1920s and 30s, kind of as postcards. The idea being that you could send someone a Christmas poem instead of a Christmas card. T.S. Eliot's Christmas poems are not very cheerful, and I feel like they would be interesting poems to receive instead of a Christmas card. A lot of them are about death. He definitely had a association of Christmas and death. And there were 2 poems in here, Journey of the Magi and Mariana, which I really liked, and the others kind of went over my head and I didn't really get much out of. So a bit of a mixed bag, but you know, T.S. Eliot is a bit like that for me, I guess. Then I also read a couple of classic short story collections in December. One was this. This is The Looking Glass and Other Stories by Machado de Assis, who is a Brazilian Australian writer who I really like. I will say that I think the best story in this selection is probably The Alienist, which I have read before and is quite long and takes up a lot of this collection, but I enjoy the other stories too. Machado de Assis is just a great writer, really good writing and good eye for characters. I feel like I probably enjoy his longer work more than his short stories. I think my favourite thing by him is still the posthumous memoirs of Brascubas, but I still really enjoyed this and it was good fun to read. And then I also read this. This is the folio book of great short stories, and this has quite a variety of stories in it. From Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, Anton Chekhov, Catherine Mansfield, Angela Carter, Octavia E. Butler, and many more. And I thought this was a good and interesting collection. There were quite a few short stories in here that were rereads for me, and I would say that in general, nearly all of my favourite short stories in here were the ones I'd read before, and quite a lot of the ones that were new to me I didn't get that much out of, with the exception of the short story by Octavia E. Butler, Speech Sounds, which was fantastic and really, really good, and I'd never read that before, and it's reminded me that I need to read more by Octavia E. Butler because I've only read Kindred apart from that short story. That was definitely the standout one for me. There were some other great short stories in here that I loved, but they were ones that I'd already read, and nice to have a lovely addition with some great short stories in that I have read before and I love, such as Bliss by Catherine Mansfield or The Signalman by Charles Dickens, which are two of my favourite short stories. And yeah, this was a good read. Before I move on to the 6 books I read from the 21st century in December, I also read this. This is The Office Party by John Godber, and this was the play that we picked for our book club in December. I'm going to put this book down because it's very reflective and shiny, but this is a play from 1992, and it is about an office Christmas party, and we're basically following a bunch of people who work at a kind of marketing advertising company in Leeds in the run-up to their Christmas party, and it looks a lot at kind of like the office politics and the kind of sexual tension between various characters. It is, I would say, self-consciously sleazy in that, like, there is a very sleazy atmosphere in the office, and it is meant to be inappropriate, and I think the playwright is saying that it's inappropriate, but also it does mean it's like quite uncomfortable to read at points. I think it probably would have been better performed, like some of the pacing and some of the comedy especially. There are a few bits which are still very funny, reading it in print, but I think some of the comedy would have been better on stage, but it was still an interesting read, and yeah, it was kind of festive, so that was fun. So now onto the books I read from the 21st century in December. So first I want to talk about The Psychopath Club by Sandra Bond, and it is following a 15-year-old Daryl who lives in a small town in the US, and he thinks that he is a psychopath and wants to be a serial killer, mostly because he is sort of lonely and angry and bullied at school. And we follow what happens when he and a few of his kind of like outsider schoolfellows form the Psychopath Club, where they decide that they're going to study psychopaths because they're interested in true crime. But Daryl himself actually kind of wants to be a psychopath and thinks that he is one. But meanwhile, some very weird kind of magic realism, speculative things start happening to Daryl, and there's lots of like parallel universe fun going on. This is very, very weird and twisted in a very excellent way, and the characterization is great, and the kind of like twists and turns of the plot are really well done. So I think this is a really great book and one I'd recommend, especially if you like things that are quite weird. And then I also read Ghostlight by Joseph O'Connor. I didn't actually read this physical edition, I listened to this on audiobook. I got a few books that I own physically out of the library on audiobook this month to try and like get a bit of a hold on my physical TBR in December, and also, as I said, December is often a time when I end up with a lot of audiobook time just because of various Christmassy stuff. So I listened to Ghostlight on audiobook and enjoyed it, and this basically tells the complicated love story between real-life historical figure playwright John Synge and an actress called Molly, who he was engaged to. And we're partly following Molly when she's older in the 1950s, and then we flash back to her kind of in the 1900s when she meets Synge and kind of looking at their relationship. I would say that I enjoyed this overall. I thought it was a really powerful read, and there were moments of like brilliance that were really, really moving and powerful that I thought worked so well. I would say that I think overall it was probably slightly on the more literary side of my taste. Like quite a lot of it was written in the second person, which I think worked, but I also found like slightly distancing. I'm not sure whether audiobook was necessarily the right choice for me for this, but I still found it a really interesting read, and I'm keen to try more by Joseph O'Connor in the future. I hear Shadowplay is really good as well. The final 4 books I want to talk about today have all made it into my top books of 2023, so I'll link that video down below and I talk about them there as well. So first I want to mention Rose and the Burma Sky by Rosanna Maka. This is a wonderful historical novel set in the 1930s and 40s in Nigeria and Burma, which is now called Myanmar, but was Burma at the time that this book is set. This book basically follows the coming of age story of a Nigerian boy called Obi. He's growing up in a small village in Nigeria, and his kind of unrequited love for one of his school fellows, a girl called Rose. And this book looks at Rose and Obi, and it is both a kind of coming of age story and a war story. Obi becomes a soldier, and we know at the beginning of the book that he ends up in the Burmese jungle thinking about Rose, and then we kind of get to hear about his life before that point. This book was so powerful and so interesting. It's a bit of the Second World War that you don't read about so much, and Obi and Rose were so well crafted as characters, so interesting and complex, and their stories were so powerful to read. And there was just so much I loved about this book. I thought it was fantastically written, really powerful, containing a lot of really interesting social critique about mid-20th century colonialism, and it was just really, really good. So I highly recommend Rose in the Burma Sky. What a fantastic book. Then I also loved The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue, another work of historical fiction, this one set in 1918 Dublin during the flu epidemic. We're following a young nurse, Julia Power, who is working on the maternity/fever ward as a midwife. So she is looking after women who have the flu and are also due to give birth very soon. And we basically follow her over 2 days on this ward, what happens to the women she's looking after, and the friendship she develops with a young woman called Bridie, who is sent to help on the ward. And it's just exceptionally powerful, really well written. The dynamic between Bridie and Julia is fantastic, and the kind of gaps in both of their knowledges and the way they kind of teach each other certain things is just fantastic. Julia has a lot more scientific knowledge, but Bridie knows a lot of things about life that Julia is quite naive about. And then the way this book looks at kind of illness and childbirth, I suppose, is just fantastic. This book contains a lot of very graphic scenes of quite grim childbirth. You know, it is 1918, and all of these women are ill as well, but it is really, really fantastic and very powerful, and I would definitely recommend it. Such a great book. Then in December I also read and loved The New Life by Tom Crewe. This is set in 1890s Britain, and follows 2 men, John and Henry, as they come together to write a book about homosexuality, which they hope will change the law and change people's thoughts and opinions about this. Both of these men are married men. John and his wife have been married for a long time and have some children. He is gay, he has always kind of known that, and he has recently met and fallen in love with a man called Frank, and Henry has recently got married to a young woman called Edith, who he thinks maybe might be slightly in love with another woman. And we kind of follow these 2 men, their lives, their complex relationships with each other and with the people around them, and what happens when they decide to write this book. This was such an interesting novel in so many ways. I feel like The New Life really captures the feeling of the 1890s, which was in some ways such a great time of possibility, where there was a lot of social change and a lot of appetite for social change, but also there was a lot of reaction, and also there was still a lot of fear, and kind of older views were still prevailing. I feel like this was a really interesting book for me to read this year, at the end of this year, after having read a lot of Victorian New Woman fiction this year, because the New Woman movement and the kind of New Life movement, which was a real thing, did kind of overlap quite a lot. Edith, Henry's wife, is definitely kind of part of the New Woman movement, and the idea of all this appetite for social change and all this excitement for social change, but also the limitations of this point in time. I just thought that was so well drawn and so interesting. I didn't realise until the kind of author's note of this book that it is based loosely on 2 real historical people who did write a book together called Sex and Version, which was a book that came out in the 1890s that was about homosexuality, which is really, really interesting. The book is quite loosely inspired by those real figures, and interestingly, I was reading some of the reviews on Goodreads, and I think some of the people who knew the history of the real historical figures behind this were quite disappointed by the fact that it was very loosely based on that. But as someone who didn't know the exact history of these individuals that inspired this book, I thought it was really, really fantastic and just really, really powerful, really well done. The characterization and the complexities of the characterization was so good, and the kind of complicated issues the book dealt with in terms of like, when do you protect yourself and your loved ones over trying to make the world a better place? At what point does self-preservation and the preservation of those people who are important to you become more important than trying to make the world better for other people? Like, I feel like those discussions were really, really interesting in this book. I will also just say that I really love the cover of this novel, because I feel like the cover of this novel is so perfect. This has a kind of like half dust jacket, and so underneath the dust jacket we have this kind of like arts and crafts, old-fashioned looking to the past, kind of Victorian, late Victorian design, and then over the top of it we have a photograph, and obviously photography was kind of coming into its own in the second half of the Victorian period, and I feel like the kind of combination of different styles kind of summing up the very different traditions in late Victorian society, and how the 1890s was a time that was really like a war between like tradition and new thought. Also how like the arts and crafts movement is looking to the past but is also trying to do something new with it. Like, I don't know, I just thought this cover design is one of the best cover designs I've ever seen in terms of like how well it interacts with the themes of the book. So I thought this was great, and yeah, highly recommend this one. Then the final book I have to talk about in my December wrap-up is in fact the book I declared my favourite book of 2023, and that is Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson. This was fantastic. I listened to this on audiobook as well, rather than reading this physical edition, and the audiobook was really good. And this is just a wonderful novel about family and heritage and history and secrets, and about some really complicated characters who are just so well drawn, and this book is beautifully written. So in this book we're following two siblings, brother and sister, Byron and Benny, and they have been brought together after the death of their mother, because their mother has left a voice recording with her lawyer, Mr. Mitch, and she says that she wants Byron and Benny to listen to this recording together. And then this recording starts and she says, I need to tell you all the secrets about our family that I haven't told you before. I need to tell you about your sister. They have no idea that they have a sister. And in this recording, their mother tells them a story beginning in the Caribbean in, I think, the 1960s, and spanning to the UK and to California, where they live now, explaining a lot of family secrets that she hasn't told them before, and obviously going on to tell them about their sister. And this book was just so good. It's a kind of dual narrative. You know, we spend quite a lot of time with Benny and Byron in the present day, and then we also spend a lot of time in the story of the past that their mother is telling them. And there was so much in this book that I loved. It is wonderfully, beautifully written. It was so powerful. I spent plenty of the book crying as I listened to the audiobook, and the relationship between Byron and Benny is so believable. They're both such complicated, really believable characters. Benny has kind of been estranged from her parents and from her brother for quite a long time, and we kind of learn out why, and the way that storyline is unpacked is just fantastic. The way this book looks at kind of like food and baking and how these things have brought this family together over time, and how kind of like heritage and family traditions kind of come down through food. I thought that was fantastic, and I just loved this book so much. I just loved everything about it. It was fantastic, and everyone should read it. It also was one of those books that like really nicely blended historical elements with contemporary stuff in a way that I thought was so well done. And there are so many like nice tiny little details that I loved, and so many things where like something is set up early on, or like a seed is planted and then you understand later what it means, which I just loved. And I just thought this was so good. It was so good. Highly recommend Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson. What a fantastic book. Probably, I think, my favourite book of the year. So there we have it. Those are the books that I read in December 2023. It was a great reading month. I read a lot, so I'm sorry if this video has been very long. Please do let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, what was your best book of December 2023. And that's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.